Hassan Rouhani's inauguration as president of the Islamic Republic of Iran for a second term in office was attended by upwards of 100 foreign delegations. At a time when the U.S. seeks to isolate Iran over the JCPOA and defensive ballistic missiles, this international support of the Islamic Republic and its democracy sends an important message. While the Rouhani administration has insisted it will not violate the nuclear deal, it has also made clear that violations by other parties to the deal, specifically the United States, will not go unanswered. That and more on tonight's discussion about Rouhani's second-term foreign policy challenges with me, Waqar Rizvi.
I, as the President of Iran, in the presence of the Holy Quran and before the Iranian nation, swear by God the Almighty to safeguard the state religion, the Islamic establishment, as well as the country's constitution. I would do my best in the responsibilities I have. I would also dedicate myself to serving the people, perfection of the country, promotion of faith and morals, supporting righteousness and the spread of justice.
These were the words of Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, who took the oath of office for a second term during a ceremony attended by high-ranking foreign officials held at the country's parliament building. Rouhani touched upon a series of domestic and international issues. He pledged to exhaust all efforts to safeguard people's rights, while stressing that economic reforms would be on top of his agenda. The Iranian president reiterated that Tehran is seeking peace in its foreign policy. In his remarks, Rouhani issued a stern warning against any violation of the landmark nuclear deal reached between Iran and the P5+1 group of countries in 2015. He stressed that those who want to tear up the nuclear deal should know that they would be ripping up their own political life.
The world should know that any violation of commitments within this international agreement will be met with a unanimous reaction from the Iranian government and the people.
On the U.S. government's old habit of breaking promises, the Iranian president stressed that Tehran would not sit idle if the White House breaches the nuclear agreement. Rouhani said Washington has proven that it's an unreliable partner to the West and even to its longtime allies. Observers believe the U.S. government would see greater commitment from the EU if Washington continues with its anti-Tehran measures.
If the present efforts to undermine the JCPOA continue, they will see the reverse effort by the Europeans to escalate their commitment to the JCPOA.
Elsewhere in his comments, the Iranian president blamed foreign powers for the chaos and instability in the Middle East. He once again stressed that regional issues can only be resolved using dialogue and cooperation. Rouhani also expressed the Islamic Republic's willingness to invite regional countries to end the seemingly unending crisis in Yemen. According to Iran's president, today is the time for the mother of all negotiations, not mother of all bombs.
Our guests for this debate are Professor at the University of Tehran, Professor Hamid Mousavi, who is joining us live right here in Tehran in our studios. And we're also joined by Mr. Michael Lane, who is with the American Institute for Foreign Policy, and he is joining us live from Washington. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Mr. Lane, I'll start with you. Do you believe the effort to isolate Iran, Mr. Lane, has failed?
No. The effort by the United States and other Western powers to keep pressure on Iran to try and persuade it to change some of its behavioral characteristics has not failed, notwithstanding a respectable delegation that traveled to Tehran to witness the inauguration of President Rouhani. Nonetheless, it still could have been stronger or more impressive. So there has been some success on that part to put pressure on the Iran government. There continues to be some success. The removal of the nuclear sanctions has not responded with the robust investment in Iran that the President Rouhani had hoped for. And so these continue on. As we look at the next 4 years, I look at the needle that Rouhani really has to thread in terms of foreign policy, and he should have two main objectives, or at least there's two main objectives that he campaigned on for his re-election. The first was to rid Iran of all the non-nuclear sanctions that now exist against the country, and the second was to correct the problem of lack of foreign investment, to have sustainable investment that will create a more robust economy and help the Iranian people. Those are the two objectives that he should be looking for, that I believe he will be looking for in foreign policy over the last 4 years, but it's a very small needle to thread, and we'll have to see how he does.
Professor Mousavi, what do you make of that? Because certainly with the 100+ delegations in town for this inauguration ceremony, it certainly seems like the U.S. has failed in isolating Iran.
I mean, I would agree that the United States is pressuring Iran. Nevertheless, I think the effort to isolate Iran has failed in the sense that the Europeans are very keen in keeping the nuclear agreement, whereas the Trump administration essentially wants to scrap it. We've just had the S-722 sanctions that were signed by Trump, and it's trying to pressure Iran essentially, but the Europeans, as well as other countries, are not in agreement with the US administration. Furthermore, while I would agree that there is pressure on Iran, nevertheless, we also have to acknowledge that US foreign policy in the Middle East has failed miserably. I mean, if you see the result of US foreign policy in the Middle East, it has created a lot of instability in places such as Yemen, Syria, Bahrain. The relationship with Saudi Arabia is very fraught. So I think if we're talking about the success and failures of the foreign policy of Iran, we should also be talking about the foreign policy of the United States as well.
Okay, so Mr. Lane, I wanted to pick up on that point that Professor Mousavi there made about the Europeans specifically, because, you know, Federica Mogherini flew into town to attend this inauguration ceremony in part, of course, as she's had meetings as well with Iranian officials. That's quite a strong sign, is it not, Mr. Lane, that there is that gap that exists between how the EU and the United States view Iran?
Well, yes, there is daylight between the United States and part of the EU in terms of the way they're viewing the approach to Iran, and it's certainly not a unified approach. The foreign minister's decision to visit Tehran for the inauguration was certainly not an uncontroversial move, even throughout Europe, but nonetheless she did it, and it seems to have gone well. We'll see what the payoff is afterwards in terms of those things. But again, the objective that I think Iran has for the next 4 years in terms of executing its foreign policy is to find a way to persuade the remaining sanctions against it to be lifted, and to persuade the international business community to make major, significant economic investments in Iran. And I don't know that there's a clear path. I don't see the clear path to that happening. Certainly, President Rouhani has proved himself to be ingenious and resourceful, and he may indeed have a roadmap that he intends to follow that will accomplish his objectives. But I don't yet see that roadmap developing, and don't know how it's going to happen.
Okay, so Professor Mousavi, you know, if we look at the statements made today by the president and by other Iranian officials, sanctions weren't directly mentioned. Obviously, there was mention of U.S. Possible violations of this nuclear deal, but it does seem that the Iranians aren't as worried, are they, about specifically just sanctions at this point, because they also probably do see this gap between the Europeans and Americans, and the fact that the Europeans really do want to do business with Iran and have already started doing so.
Yes, well, essentially sanctions are effective when there is agreement, there's an international essentially agreement to sanction a country. If the United States sanctions Iran unilaterally, of course that's going to have its own effects, but it's not going to have the effects the United States wants, especially if the Europeans decide to not abide by the path the Trump administration is following. I mean, we just had a multi-billion-dollar deal with the French Total company, with Iran's oil industry. Nevertheless, I think it is true that Rouhani is going to have a difficult time in the next 4 years, in the sense that the Trump administration is actively trying to sabotage the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal, if we put the details aside, essentially has a very simple premises. Iran accepted some restrictions on its nuclear program, and in return, sanctions were to be lifted for the economy to be revitalized. Nevertheless, what happened in actuality is that the Americans, especially since Trump came into power, have been trying to, backtrack on that deal. And what that is doing is essentially they cannot expect Iran to abide by the deal while the Americans are not abiding by their side of the deal. Now, I should also stress that the deal is not a bilateral agreement. Rather, it's a multilateral agreement. So the Americans are just one party of that deal, and there's also the Europeans and Iran. Nevertheless, I think the Americans are trying to actively sabotage it.
Okay, so Mr. Lane, there really is no doubt that Trump would want to sabotage this deal. He's said as much, and the New York Times article a couple of days ago, which said that he's genuinely actively looking for some minor violation on Iran's part, or made-up violation even, so that he finds an excuse to get out. And he's actually angry at some of his officials about not being able to find such a violation. That's very clear. So if Trump really does want to sabotage this deal, but then, as Professor Mousavi there said, this is not a bilateral deal, this is a multilateral deal. This all reflects very badly on the United States, doesn't it?
Well, I don't know that I buy that Trump is looking to sabotage the deal. Remember, Donald Trump is the kind of guy who has an opening bid for negotiation. And yes, he's said that he wants to scrap the deal, but he hasn't done it yet, and it's been 6 months. Well, why has he not done it? Well, number one, for the most part, Iran is in compliance, although if you scour the deal, you can find some sort of pretext violation on either side, someplace in it. I mean, there's not a difficult thing to find that. So it may be, and I'm not saying this is actually the case, but it may be that Trump is just using this as an excuse. It's his first offer. And then he says, oh, we found this violation, and he's looking to renegotiate the deal. Now, at that point, it becomes a matter of how significant a program is he trying to renegotiate, and what is Iran and Europe's reaction to the goals and objectives that he's trying to put in the renegotiation. But I'm not convinced that he's really trying to scrap it at this point. Remember, this is a document that's an executive agreement in the United States. President Obama declined to submit this to the Senate for treaty ratification to make it the law of the land. Right now, it's just a document that President Obama signed, and that doesn't carry much legal weight at all in the United States.
Okay, so Professor Mousavi, obviously President Rouhani has the pressures on him, the political pressure within the country, because Iranians do see the actions carried out by the United States vis-a-vis the latest sanctions, at the very least, as somewhat of a violation of this deal, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the Iranians have been very clear that both the renewal of the Iran Sanctions Act during the end of Obama's tenure, as well as the recent sanction that was passed just a few days ago, do violate the deal. And is actually Rouhani today, he said that he didn't mention sanctions explicitly, but he said even though his government is following a path of moderation, nevertheless he will stand up to any violation of the deal. And I would disagree with Professor Lane, though, on the issue of Trump trying to sabotage the deal. First of all, regarding the issue of renegotiation, this deal was the result of intensive negotiation for several years. So it's not a deal that can be scrapped or renegotiated quite easily. Also, Iran, as well as the Europeans, as a matter of fact, have been very clear that there is going to be no renegotiation. This was a deal that was signed and done. It was even a resolution in the Security Council was passed in support of it. So opening up for renegotiation is not on the table. Also, on the issue of trying to sabotage the deal, I would also disagree in the sense that even though the Trump administration has not scrapped the deal explicitly or openly, at the same time they have passed very, I would say, intense as well as very, how should I say it, very powerful sanctions both on Russia and Iran. Well, Russia is a different story, but regarding Iran, this would definitely violate the deal because actually Article 26 of the nuclear agreement specifically says that the United States should not reintroduce or reimpose sanctions that were lifted as a result of the nuclear deal, and that's not the case here.
Okay, so Mr. Lane, we're getting a picture now of the fact that the next 4 years for President Rouhani will be challenging when it comes to this specific issue over the JCPOA. How do you think that, Mr. Lane, this will play out, though? Because as I just spoke about with Professor Mousavi, Iranians within the country feel very strongly about this issue. Even though they back the deal still, they do feel that the latest U.S. sanctions do violate that deal. And that's pressure that, you know, a president of a country has to respond to, doesn't he?
Well, first let me explain for our audience that the new sanctions coming to Iran as a result of the congressional vote last week are something that if he thought he could have sustained a veto on that legislation, President Trump probably would have vetoed it. Not necessarily because he disagrees with the substance or the outcome of the legislation, but because he does feel very strongly that it unconstitutionally infringes on the prerogatives of our chief executive, the president, in terms of their ability to conduct foreign policy. So he was not at all on board with this particular piece of legislation, and I think he signed it very, very reluctantly. As far as the future of the challenges that Mr. Rouhani will be facing, one thing that we need to look at, remember a couple months ago, President Trump ordered a comprehensive review by our State Department, our Defense Department, our National Security Council, et cetera, a comprehensive review, an overall reconsideration of what our policy towards Iran is going to be. When that report comes out, if it turns out that it is a more moderate document that is looking for ways to cooperate with Iran, I think that there will be an opening there for the two companies to see if they can find something in common, although I have my doubts about that. But if it turns out that it's more of a hard-line document, I would expect the president to accept that and follow that, and that really makes President Rouhani's challenges much more difficult. Here's the final thing on this. The United States is looking for behavioral changes in the way the government of Iran conducts what we believe are support for terrorism, destabilization, agitation in the region, and at least President Rouhani and the Supreme Leader look to be somewhat in concert on this, and they say they're looking for ways to get along and engage the international community, but a deal breaker is the need for them to change their behavior. So we seem to be at a standstill at this point.
Okay, so Professor Mousavi, I'm glad Mr. Lane there mentioned Ayatollah Khamenei's statement to it, and that obviously statement was made when President Rouhani was endorsed as president for a second time. I'm wondering, when Ayatollah Khamenei specifically said, yes, we want interaction with the world, but obviously he added fine print saying that obviously there are adversaries out there, there are people out there who do want to harm the Iranian nation. How do you think all of that will play out when it comes to the United States? Do you think that the likes of President Rouhani are really losing any sleep over any negative U.S. actions, considering the rest of the world really is opening up to Iran?
Yes, I mean, definitely when we talk about interaction with other countries, it's an interaction out of respect, and I think this respect has to be mutual. So when we talk about interaction with, say, Europe or our neighbors, it's an interaction out of respect and as a result of negotiation. Nevertheless, what was just mentioned, what the United States wants, and I quote, for behavioral changes of Iran's policy, I don't think that's called interaction. That's essentially one power imposing its will on a regional power. I don't think the United States is in a position to ask or demand any changes of Iran's behavior. The United States is actually responsible for the mess in the Middle East. The invasion of Iraq essentially created all the instability that we're seeing today. And even in the United States, it has been openly mentioned that the invasion of Iraq essentially led to the rise of ISIS. And Iran is actually fighting ISIS at the moment. So for the United States to come and say that we want behavioral changes from Iran, I think is very irrational. And also I think even though Trump, his rhetoric is quite extreme, I don't think the United States even has the power to actually make changes in the region. So essentially, if I go back to my original point, we do want interaction with the world, but the United States essentially does not want a two-way dialogue. What they want is they want to dictate their will as well as their interests to the countries of the region, unfortunately.
Okay, gentlemen, we have about a minute left or so, so I wanted to get both of your final comments, a minute to each of you. Mr. Lane, I wanted to ask, again, going back to a question I asked you earlier about the next 4 years, do you think that the next 4 years for President Rouhani will be dominated by talk of the JCPOA?
I believe so, yes. At this point, I think that the Trump administration is unlikely to junk it. We had a small discussion about renegotiation. Well, it depends on what they ask for as to whether or not Iran would be. I understand their resistance immediately. But I do think the JCPOA will be dominant. But part of the fabric of the whole thing, again, will be the regional behavior that the United States has been concerned about and has itemized, which is support for groups that we consider to be terrorist groups, agitation and destabilization in the region, and color that with the fact that President Trump seems to be very, very comfortable and close with the leaders of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has a historical hard line here. It does make President Rouhani's job very difficult. He's got to really be a skilled magician here to continue to move forward.
Professor Mousavi, do you agree?
When we talk about the nuclear agreement, we have to be very specific about what it entails. In the JCPOA or the nuclear agreement, there's nothing about Iran's so-called regional behavior. It's only about the nuclear issue. So we cannot relate it to other issues, even if the United States wants to. Also regarding the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, I think actually the inauguration ceremony today was a symbol of Iran's democracy, where more than 41 million people participated in the last presidential elections, whereas Saudi Arabia essentially is very, very far from any standard of democracy. Nevertheless, we're seeing the United States supporting such a regime that is not only trying to essentially adopt a very aggressive line towards Iran, but towards other countries in the region as well, such as Iraq and Qatar as well. So I think the issues of the region are quite complicated, and essentially with Trump in power, they are going to get worse, unfortunately.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll leave it there at that, but of course we do appreciate both of your contributions to this discussion. That was Professor Hamid Mousavi of the University of Tehran, who is speaking to us live from right here in our studios in Tehran, and we were also joined by Mr. Michael Lane with the American Institute for Foreign Policy, and he had been speaking to us live from Washington. And of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.